All right.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Finding the Source. I'm here with my co-host and colleague, Dr. Ashley Luskey. Ashley and I, for the first time, well, I guess we don't get to see each other very often. I've said that on the show before because of COVID, even though her office is right next door. But today, it was a rare occasion that Ashley and I were together, a little powwow about this evening. We got to talk a little Civil War and talk about our lovely daughters. We share all kinds of war stories. A lot of fun as well. And tonight we are joined with Dierdre Cooper Owens from the University of Nebraska. Go Corn Huskers. Deirdre just told me she's not quite a football fan yet, but I'll say, and now I will lose all of our Nebraska followers right now, you haven't had much to cheer for a few years. I am from Indiana, and when the Indiana Hoosiers can beat Nebraska in football, something is wrong with the universe. I am curious about this, Deirdre, before I tell the folks a little bit about your background. Is Godfather's Pizza, does it still exist in Nebraska?
It sure does. I pass it quite often. I have never gone in.
Well, I think you will now, because that is the last honest job I had in my life. In college, I worked at Godfather's Pizza in Indianapolis, Indiana. It was some hard work, man. It was tough. You get out 2, 3 o'clock in the morning after a really, really long shift making pizzas. It was quite an experience. And among the many benefits, besides a cute little uniform that you had to wear, every night, every shift, you got unlimited soft drinks and a little 12-inch pizza. And a Godfather's Pizza, as you're going to discover, Deirdre, because I'm confident that my recommendation will lead you there, it has as much grease as you can possibly imagine, because it is a deep dish, a Chicago-like pizza. No, I'm telling you, it is really quite tasty. Godfather's Pizza. I'm glad to know they were a national chain, and I think they have sort of retrenched over the years. But it's good stuff.
I'll try it.
Well, you know that Deirdre is a fitness guru, though, so I don't know how she's going to balance these two things, Pete. You're trying to undermine all of her routine and commitment here.
Well, you work out, Ashley, so that one can eat or drink.
That's true. That's really the only reason. Yeah.
Only reason I get on my Peloton bike just for that, because I know there will be a reward. And right now we are in, as Ashley knows, and Deirdre, I hope you do as well, we are in peep season. Peeps are just absolute delicacy. That it was not sold fall and winter. They, for whatever reason, had to call off production, but they are back in full swing.
Yeah.
I cannot live without my peeps.
I bought one, actually a little stick of them for Valentine's Day for my husband, because he is a Peeps fan.
Oh, how sweet. I hope my wife is listening and that she might do the same. So I'm just absolutely thrilled to have Deirdre here. Deirdre and I have had occasions to work together, and I should note that she came to the Civil War Institute and did just a fantastic job. I believe, Deirdre, you even worked with some of our high school scholarship students who raved about you as well. And so, we've had some lovely opportunities. We've been on a few documentaries, I think, together as well. And so happy for Deirdre, because the position she has at the University of Nebraska is it's a distinguished position. It's a chair position. And let me make sure I get the name right. It is Charles and Linda Wilson Professor in the History of Medicine and the Director of Humanities in the Medicine Program. And that, of course, when you can maybe talk to us a little bit about your position there, because I'm sure that you have your hand in all kinds of things. Deirdre just ended a session with, now again, let's make sure I get this right. This is in Philadelphia. Could you just go ahead and tell our audience what the other program that you oversee?
Because I don't think I work enough. I have another job where I'm the director of the program in African American history at the Library Company of Philadelphia. I would invite people to visit our website, as the actual institution is not open to the public because of COVID. But the program in African American history is our anchor program, and it is the country's oldest cultural institution, founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1731.
Very cool. Fantastic. That sounds great. And so we can go to the website, and you have, I assume, a variety of programs around them.
Yep.
They can get to
www.librarycompany.org.
So Deirdre started her academic career at Bennett College in Greensboro, North Carolina. I think I told you this before. When I lived in Greensboro, I could see Bennett. I lived that close. Yeah, absolutely. Right down there.
Yeah.
And then from there, you went on ultimately to UCLA, where you did your PhD. And you've taught at other institutions. You taught at Ole Miss. And you also taught, you taught in New York City and not in Queens College. Queens College. That's right. That's right. And then you've been at the University of Nebraska now for 2 years.
Yeah, so this is my second academic year.
An academic year. And I think that the book that started it all for Deirdre is this one, Medical Bondage.
The little book that could.
Well, published by the University of Georgia.
Yes.
And, we're going to have an opportunity to talk about this in depth. But I thought that this would be an opportunity for our audiences to think more broadly about the institution of slavery, the experience of enslaved people. It's a subject matter that, like any subject, it's hard for people to know, okay, so where do I begin? And we're going to use the word that almost always pushes a general audience away, and that's the word of historiography. Mm-hmm. And what historiography simply is, it is the conversation among historians.
Yeah.
And that doesn't sound terribly exciting on the surface, but I think it has its moments, and especially the institution of slavery and how historians have discussed it over the years. It's gotten contentious, and understandably so.
Yeah.
So Ashley's going to jump in as well, but I thought we would start with the document. That was kind of the hook of this program, and Ashley and I, when we agreed upon doing this, and then Ashley dutifully always gets the document started for us. And I, of course, always run in the opposite direction. But tonight, I'm not going to do that, Ashley. What we're going to start with is a photo of the plantation, Belle Grove. And Ashley's going to try to share that with us.
Right. Let me just pull it up real quick here.
There it is.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Many people in our audience have probably seen Belle Grove because it's at the epicenter of the Cedar Creek battlefield in the fall of 1864. This historic house is still open to the public, and they do a wide range of programming there that discusses the experience of enslaved people. I'm going to give us a very brief and focused story about an incident that occurred at Belle Grove, an incident that occurred in the fall of 1860. And then I'm going to show you a little bit of a trial transcript of an enslaved woman who was accused of murdering the woman who owned her, the plantation mistress. We're going to look at that document, and we're going to have Deirdre work our way through it and talk about the different ways of interpreting it. So quickly, the fall of 1860, the woman's name, the enslaved woman, is named Harriet. Her owner, Mrs. Cooley. Harriet and Mrs. Cooley had a very contentious relationship, a number of incidents that occurred within that house. And as I remind our students that these plantation homes, that the facade creates this appearance of harmony, of tranquility. And in fact, what happened behind those doors was something quite different. So we're not exactly certain what transpired, but it appears that this confrontation between Harriet, the enslaved woman, and Mrs. Cooley took place. As you look at this house, on the lower level, you see two windows. It's down in that bottom level that was called, I believe, it's called a pig room, that they had a very nasty, ugly confrontation in which it appears that Mrs. Cooley was knocked out. She was then dragged across the front yard over to the smokehouse. And sometime later that afternoon, the overseer walking by the smokehouse heard a woman moaning from the inside. And when he went to investigate, he discovered that the smokehouse door had been locked, obviously from the outside. He had to rush around before he was able to find an axe and to break into the smokehouse to discover there was Mrs. Cooley, the white woman, and she was sitting near the flames that was, of course, burning inside the smokehouse. Her clothes were burned. She was a little bruised and charred and disoriented. The enslaved woman, Harriet, was there. Harriet helped take her from the smokehouse back into Belle Grove. Mrs. Cooley went in and out of consciousness for the next few days. She never, ever accused anyone of attacking her. In fact, she said that she had fallen that for some reason she decided to get up into the rafters of the smokehouse, and she said she fell, which of course was a fairly curious story, but everyone at the moment believed her. And it would suggest that maybe there was a perception that Mrs. Cooley maybe had some mental health issues. But the point is that she ultimately died from these injuries. Again, there were no accusations made until they buried Mrs. Cooley. And when they buried Mrs. Cooley, it was not her husband, but it was other white men in the area that insisted upon an investigation. That investigation led them to the smokehouse. They went up into the rafters to see that the rafters were covered with dust and dirt. Clearly, nobody had been up there. I won't give you the rest of the details about the investigation. I will tell you how it turned out. But what did happen was a trial, and there was depositions of sorts. And we are going to see one of those deposition from a white woman living in Belgrove, and a woman who described one of the confrontations that occurred inside that house prior to the attack that led Mrs. Cooley to the smokehouse. So, Ashley, if we could go to the other document, please.
Just switch it over.
All right. I need to put my glasses on here. I'll just go ahead and I'll read it very quickly for everyone. Mrs. Hetty Cooley got up and left the room. That's the white woman, all right? And this is, again, this incident that occurred, one of many, between Harriet, the enslaved woman, and Hetty. She did not say where she was going. Not long before she left, she came up from the kitchen and said that she was not going to take Harriet's slurs, and she would not take it from a white person that she had taken from her, that Mr. Cooley would have to do something with her. She could not and would not live with her. On the same morning of that day that she was hurt, when she and Mrs. Gordon were absent for a few hours in the morning, and Harriet appeared very angry at Mrs. Cooley and abused her in her absence. Mrs. Cooley had taken a dress to make for Harriet's child, and Harriet asked me if it was done. I told her it was not. She told me that she would take it and get somebody to finish it. I told her no, we would finish it ourselves. She came in and took the dress down and said no, she would finish it or get someone else to finish it. Mrs. Cooley and Harriet had a scrimmage about a week before. I saw then in the passage of her room downstairs have a tussle. Hetty, Mrs. Cooley, raised Uncle Jack's stick to strike Harriet, and I saw Harriet jerk the stick away from Mrs. Cooley. Harriet struck at Mrs. Cooley. I did not see the lick, but Mrs. Cooley showed me a very bad mark on her arm, which Harriet gave her. And she said when she showed it to me, I have often heard Harriet abuse Mrs. Cooley and curse her. All right. Again, testimony we see in places it's a little rough, but we can all get the gist of this long history that occurred between Harriet and Mrs. Cooley. So, Dierdre, let's get us started and think about the scholarship of U.B. Phillips in the early 1900s. The scholar, or I should note, the first white scholar, who is given credit for being a pioneer in the study of slavery. He approached it with certain assumptions. I'm hoping that, again, Dierdre will talk to us a little bit about those assumptions and speculate, of course, as to what historians in the early 1900s, influenced by U.B. Phillips, how would they see this document?
I think they would see it with probably a belief in the reigning scientific and medical beliefs about Black people, that Black people were prone to anger. They tended to act out in childish ways, those kinds of things that Black people tended to be more violent. But also, I think if this were the early 20th century, when U.B. Phillips is writing his history of slavery, in particular in Black people, that it almost always is based on the words, the observations of white people talking about and discussing Black people. Black people are really kind of left out of the conversation, even though they're the main focus, right? And so I think that is something that's interesting. I also see the kinds of, when you look at that early scholarship, it's not that the sources are bad. I try not to have our students think about good or bad in that particular way, but the kind of political nature and context of the U.S. Who is writing the sources? Who's doing the research? What vantage point are they coming from? Also, what's the political stance of the historian? There's a kind of, I call it a fiction that historians still tend to uphold, that everything is objective. And I'm like, as long as human beings are involved in the enterprise of historical research and writing, objectivity is very subjective. So that's where I would really begin, like to think about where this is also coming from. This is court testimony. How do people relate stories and their experiences and remembrances in court? There's a lot that's being left out behind this testimony about why Harriet seemed to be so angry towards Mrs. Cooley. What was that relationship like? And so those are some of the questions that I would have as well.
Yeah, and I also see in this too, Dierdre, to add to your point about UB Phillips, some of the kind of mainstays of his scholarship is that belief in the benevolence of the institution of slavery. That we see a white woman who is making a dress for Harriet's child, and so on surface level we think that's a clear showing of benevolence. We see, of course, Mrs. Cooley is being subjected to Harriet's curses and verbal abuse, as well as her physical abuse, which seems, outrageous by this white woman's testimony. Again, because if we are going in from UB Phillips' perspective, right, he's going to say, wow, this was a benevolent institution, and this mistress obviously was a motherly figure, and so this assault upon her, verbal and otherwise, comes as completely unfounded. Because as you said, there's the whole other side of the story as to what happened to make Harriet so enraged at Mrs. Cooley.
Yeah, and if I can add too about UB Phillips, because now I feel like I have to kind of remember back to grad school, those first classes that you take about U.S. historiography. But also I remember, Phillips was very interested in the social and economic interpretations of slavery, right? And so this would, in many ways, kind of bode well with his argument that slavery produces great wealth, but it also is a really expensive endeavor for, slave owners. And so to think about the ways that, the owner is having someone make a dress for Harriet's child, right? So this kind of added expense of having to take care of these enslaved people, so I would also think about the kind of social and economic implications of UB Phillips's of his perspective with regard to this testimonial.
Yeah. I think you're spot on about that. I mean, certainly Phillips stressed that the economic pressures of capitalism, that the plantation system absorbed those pressures and did not inflict those pressures on the workers.
Right.
Of course, the field has changed dramatically since then, but nonetheless, he did identify the centrality of the plantation in creating a distinct political economy in the South. Eugene Genovese, someone we won't get into at depth here, but he wrote an introduction for the reprint of UB Phillips's book. Genovese quoted a student, and he noted that the student was an African-American student who, after reading UB Phillips, said, "This guy's a son of a bitch, but he's a smart son of a bitch." And I think there's something, again, the racism that comes through in UB Phillips is, I think it is hard to be able to see the contributions of his work. And that, of course, is certainly up for debate. The field shifted dramatically in the 1950s with the publication of Kenneth Stamp's Peculiar Institution. And so do you have a sense, again, Dierdre and Ashley as well, how this particular document maybe was seen differently by Stamp and historians of his ilk in the 1950s?
Yeah, I mean, once again, here you have, someone who is greatly he has a huge political viewpoint. And, whereas UB Phillips is squarely in this kind of pro-Southern stance, here you have Stamp representing the kind of oppositional viewpoint to that. And so I think, Stamp is at least interested in explicating the lives of enslaved people in ways that kind of went beyond the caricatures of UB Phillips' time. He is very intentional about making a very particular kind of, today we would call it this critical intervention, for instance, in trying to pivot the conversation to actually include Black people as not just, characters or historical actors where things are being enacted upon them, but also, what are Black people doing, or Negroes as they were called at the time? What are Negroes doing, also within this exchange of human interactions between owner and slave and overseer and all of these different actors, within the peculiar institution. So I think that there would also be maybe a more sympathetic rendering of Harriet.
Yeah, and that putting her at the forefront of, being an agent, as you said, she's not being the passive victim here necessarily. She's taking resistance into her own hands in not just small ways, breaking tools, slowing down at work, but in combating her mistress with physical violence, which to even acknowledge that, as you're saying, putting Black people at the center of the story, that they had a role to play in the institution and shaping the power dynamics of it, is so critical. And also the fact that, I think that he would think that this source exposes the degradations of slavery, what it does to Black and white alike, which had been left out, for so long, that both ends of the spectrum could be degraded.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, you raise an outstanding point. And I hope that we'll, for the next historian or historiographical trend, that we'll talk about the issue of the emotional and psychological price that enslaved people had to pay. I think that's a really important point. I think one other thing to note about the 1950s and Kenneth Stamp's emphasis on violence, I think that's crucial. Where that was almost invisible in UB Phillips's work, Stamp put that front and center. And it should remind all of us, because I suspect many of the people listening here have at one time visited a historic home in the South, and the tours of historic homes have changed radically over the last 15 years. Now, of course, you're going to find some people who are fighting that rear guard neo-Confederate view, but without question, I'm not denying that. But there are many, I think, changes. And I think that those changes, in fact, are present at Belle Grove today. I'm not certain if they interpret this incident, because if I recall, and Ashley might know more about this than I do, I believe that Belle Grove interprets an earlier period, night period. So I'm not sure this story is front and center, but I can't stress enough that Stamp's contribution in revealing that what was behind that plantation's facade of harmony and cooperation, of obedience and duty, was the lash. And it was always there and always present. And this document brings it out to the
There was something you said too, and before I answer that, I see in the comments, no, I was not a part of a forum called Civil War Talk, Mr. Richardson. But there was something that you said that made me think about the kind of difference too in the approach about era or chronology. So UB Phillips is talking about kind of American Negro slavery, right? And so there's this sense from even the title that it encompasses kind of the totality of slavery. And Stamp is very specific, right? He's talking about the antebellum South, right? So there's a much more, there's a tighter focus in terms of chronology, right? That he's really looking at the slavery that enters our kind of imaginations and thinking about slavery. People tend to kind of pinpoint it, I mean, incorrectly, but it's what we see in popular culture and even in our discussions. It's almost always the 19th century. But Stamp is also, kind of bringing our attention to when slavery is already codified. It's a kind of slavery that in some ways, and I don't want to use this word to have people think I'm saying it's static, because it isn't. but there is something that's very institutionalized about slavery in the antebellum era, and not as dynamic as, say, the 1600s and the 1700s, which is still shape-shifting.
I think actually static is a perfect word to describe U.B. Phillips' portrayal of slavery, right? Yeah, good. That's fantastic. So now let's go and move to, and again, I'm lumping a lot of historians together here. And I would like for you to talk to us about what Deborah Gray White's work, right? Which I assign it to my classes. And she initiated a historiographical change led by women, and mostly women of color.
Yeah.
And let's just all be honest here. Hell, when Deborah Gray White's work came out, path-breaking, important, again, we should continue to read that book. I don't think any of us could have imagined what followed in her wake. It's truly, it's inspiring, and it's important and rich work that we all need to come to terms with. So could you talk a little bit about Deborah Gray White, and again, how she and others might see this piece?
Yeah, thank you for that. I want to add, this is kind of the trivia, but I'll do it, kind of in celebration of Black History Month. I know Deborah, but I'm always amazed at how recent her scholarship and her intervention is. I mean, the Aren't I a Woman? Female Slaves in the Plantation South comes out in 1985. And I remember her saying the Library of Congress had to create an entire cataloging system because there were no books on Black women who lived in slavery. And so, I mean, that's just incredible. 1985, that's the late 20th century. But what I would say is, Deborah Gray White is really taking an intentional gendered lens and having us look at this. She would ask questions about Harriet and try and find out more, and probably look at census records if they existed, that listed Harriet and her child, and kind of see what people are saying about this. She would probably rely on the scholarship of, Catherine Clinton and Elizabeth Fox Genovese, who were talking about the plantation mistress, and seeing the kind of contentious relationships that enslaved people, but especially enslaved women, had with white slave owners. Those kinds of things, I think, would be interrogated. And even if you couldn't find the answers, because that's the thing, writing about enslaved people, and I say this as a historian of U.S. slavery, it's really hard because you are essentially writing about a community of people across time and space who were illiterate, right? So they don't leave written records. And almost everything you write about them, outside of those fortunate few who were literate, almost everything you write about them is from the perspective and from the words and the transcripts of people who owned them or controlled them in some way. So it becomes really difficult, and a lot of it is, and in no way am I saying that this is negative. I think it's actually good, but there's a lot of kind of speculative history that we're writing that I think creates a kind of creativity around the questions that we ask when we center Harriet as opposed to Mrs. Cooley.
Yeah, that's a really well said, right? Harriet now becomes the focal point of this narrative. She's driving. I'm going to just pick up what Ashley had said before about the psychological impact of slavery. And I've just had my students in my race and slavery class. It's a 200 level course, and I've put some pretty heavy demands on them, historiographical demands. And so they have read snippets of various authors, including they read Stanley Elkin's piece. And Stanley Elkins made the argument that slavery was so psychologically damaging, and he actually is building upon Kenneth Stamp, that slavery is so psychologically damaging that it, in essence, stripped enslaved people of their culture, of the sense of who they were as a people. And that was the thrust of his argument. And I think that Ashley was sort of asking something along those lines. And so, Dierdre, could you sort of talk about that issue and how you handle it? Because as you point out, it's hard to get into the interior world of these enslaved people when we are reading their lives through the words of the people who own them.
Yeah, and also, I think kind of adding on to that, enslaved people didn't want their lives to be publicized, so that's the other part. You literally have people who almost everything they do is public, and so from their actions, they want at least try to own their own privacy, right? And protect their inner lives. And so that's also the thing that you have to contend with, I think, as a contemporary scholar and researcher. Am I betraying these historical actors because they might not have wanted all their business in the street, so to speak? But I think in terms of Elkins's work, it's the kind of scholarship that is so well intentioned, and yet it created so much damage. Because I'll use myself as an example. Here I am, a Black person who does the history of slavery, and yet in my own kind of genealogy, I am a Gullah Geechee person. And for those who are listening, the Low Country in South Carolina, coastal Georgia, some parts of southern North Carolina and northern Florida, there were a group of essentially American marooned people of African descent who came to the colonies. And because they were isolated, there was not a lot of mixture with white people. And so they literally formed their own language and ways of being, and had these tight African retentions that are still being used today. So there's a particular language that I speak when I'm home with my family that you all may not understand. And so when someone says, oh, everything was stripped away, I'm like, really? What about these Gullah Geechee people that populate, the Low Country in South Carolina? And so there is something too that places Black people as kind of in a state of arrested development. Even the psychological studies that Elkin used. I mean, today we kind of see the problems of them, but it was this kind of sympathetic rendering of Black people as not fully formed because of the psychological damaging effect of slavery. Whereas someone like Nell Irvin Painter comes along, and she wrote a pamphlet called Soul Murder. And in it, she asked scholars, and I think this was in the 1980s, so about a decade after Deborah Gay White, Nell Irvin Painter says, we have to take into account, like a full accounting of the psychological cost of slavery, but not in a way that the process dehumanizes human beings, right? But to take into account, once again, those questions of what creates this really contentious and it seems violent relationship where Harriet the slave is abusing the slave owner. And these are instances that we don't necessarily imagine, right? When we think about slave and slave owner, and in particular, women. So yeah, I kind of see Irvin Painter's scholarship as a direct statement to Elkins's earlier research.
And I think to expand upon that too, Dierdre, this document in particular, whenever I've seen this or whenever I've heard Pete talk about it, because I know that he does feature this, a lot in his different classes for different reasons. It reminds me so much of Thavolia Glimp's work, which of course built so much upon these early scholars and Deborah Gray White and so forth. And while Thavolia Glimp, who I think is just brilliant in the way that she in Out of the House of Bondage, she's talking about the interplay between, of course, the slaves, especially domestic, servants, domestic slaves, and the slaveholding mistress. She's getting into that relationship much more deeply and seeing how slaves undermined their mistress's power and could turn them into these violent, women who didn't know themselves, who didn't know kind of how to function in the world after, slavery fell apart. But so much of that, her work was possible by the previous work that had delved more deeply into the lives of slaves to give them their agency, to understand more of their give and take, the way they manipulated the system with their mistresses and their masters. But that heavily focused, gendered focus that Glimp brings to the table. She's obviously the direct, offspring of these people of stamp, who focuses so much on violence, and getting into, the depth of these Black women's lives and how they negotiated this system, that she, to me is one of the kind of the leading descendants of some of those foundational scholars these days, that you're speaking about.
Yeah. I mean, yes, I agree. I mean, it's her work is amazing. But also what she does too, she brings us out of slavery to think about the moment of Reconstruction, right, and how that also changes the power relations. And it's something that, and I don't know if you all teach this. I'm sure you probably do, because they're such great teaching tools. but I literally just introduced my students yesterday in my class to the WPA narratives. And I'm like, yes, they're problematic for a number of reasons, but it provides us a snapshot as well of how formerly enslaved people thought about their owners, and I said, you'll often find that there are two people who emerge as the most violent when we view the totality of WPA slave narratives, typically the overseers and the plantation mistress.
Right.
And people are kind of shocked to think about a woman as being the violent one. They always think about the man. And these people talk about the little ways that, someone throws something at you, or, the verbal abuse or those kinds of things. So it also opens up another conversation around gender that, to go back to Deborah Gay White, that emerges in the 1980s about women.
Sure.
I hope that people, again, can send in their questions. I did not encourage that before, which I should have. So please do that. And also, I think Ashley and I will work on coming up with sort of a reading list. We have tossed out a lot of titles. There's a recent book, They Were Her Property, White Women, oops, let's get that on there, as Slave Owners. Actually, if you want, we can take that. Let's go ahead and take that off. There it is.
Yeah.
And I have not read this. I've heard wonderful things about it. I've assigned it to my class, so we'll be reading it soon. But Ashley and I will come up with a reading list. Another book, and I will come clean here. I have not read this either.
Oh, you have to read it. You got to read it.
I have. Her story is it's a tragic one. She's tragic. She died of cancer.
Very young.
Very young, and she was a student of Drew Goodman Faust.
Mm-hmm.
I believe our own Jim Downs here at Gettysburg College, he was either a TA with her, or he was a student and she was his TA, but they have a relationship.
Yeah.
The point being is that the literature that has come out about this subject is just so incredibly rich, and Dierdre has a prominent place in it. And I would again like for us to turn our attention to medical bondage. Here it is again. There we go. And so,
hey, Pete, before we get into that, can I just answer? I have a question fielded, I believe, from a student actually, which is great to have them involved in this conversation. Is there a lot of scholarship on the psychological impact of slavery on enslaved women, or is it a field that's more recently being discussed amongst historians?
Yeah, so I would say, it's not even a book, but I would point you to the Nell Irvin Painter Soul Murder publication. It's very small. It's literally pamphlet size. I would also, of course, at Stephanie Camp's Closer to Freedom that Professor Carmichael just picked up, even though it's not explicitly about the psychology of slavery, but what it does in its discussion of resistance, the kind of the daily resistance that goes on, it does delve a bit deeper into the psychological impact of slavery and how people develop what she calls kind of three bodies. She says at least three bodies, and these kind of like bodies of pleasure and pain and all of these kinds of things. So there is a kind of explicit discussion around psyche, the psyche. I'm trying to think too about Hortense Spillers is a theorist, not necessarily a historian, but she writes a groundbreaking article called Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, an American grammar book on race. And it's a heavy theoretical read, but if you can get around it, and it took me about 5 times over the years to finally understand the article, but if you can get around it, she is also really tackling the psychological dimensions of slavery changing across time and space. So those are some of the ones that I would name.
Can you say that last title again for us?
Hortense Spillers has an article, and if you have access to a database, it's called Mama's Baby, Papa Maybe, an American grammar book on race. Yeah, that's a wonderful question.
We have several students that I can identify who are listening here tonight. So this is very good for them.
Excellent. My Dierdre, I just got this class approved on race and American slavery. Obviously, I've taught Southern history here for a number of years, but I thought it was time to do something more focused. And we have very small classes at Gettysburg College, which is fantastic.
Yeah, which is great.
For 12, 13 students so we could have nice, intimate conversations because we are back on campus. But by delight and surprise, we've exceeded really what our limit is supposed to be. We're up to 25 or 26. We just read Barbara Field's Races and Ideology, which that's no walk in the park at all. So, but I'm very pleased to see their energy and their willingness to engage these very difficult ideas and concepts. As we start to make that transition, do we have any other questions, Ashley, that we can?
Not right now. Nope.
Good, excellent. So you said something very interesting about, again, the book that I have not read, Stephanie Camp, and you mentioned that there were 3 different, in essence, identities that she believed that enslaved women had to use or to utilize. And so we're going to use this again, maybe to transition over to your book.
Okay.
I'm just wondering, though, that if in fact, as we know, that enslaved people, women or men, that they had to wear many masks. They had to wear those many masks for their own survival, that they're always taking the temperature in the room. And I'm struck by a quote that I read in Michael O'Brien's for 3-volume, right? 3-volume intellectual history of the Old South, in which he quoted, and I don't remember who it was related to in terms of an intellectual, but it was an incident in which a man was on one side of the river and he was white. And on the other side of the river, there was an African American. And he yelled, the white man yelled across the river and inquired basically about, who are you? Like, are you this or that? This enslaved man said, I have no self. Which is just a shattering comment if you think about it, right? Because, of course, he didn't know who he was because he had to be so many different things at so many different times. And so with that comment, I would like for you to again sort of think about the psychological pain and damage that was inflicted by slavery. And how does that then, of course, sort of transfer to your study about how the bodies of enslaved women were used and manipulated as well?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that. It is it's a sad, a kind of sad point, I think, for all of us to kind of mull over and meditate on. But the psychological effects of racism, really, and anti-Black racism that comes because of slavery's growth and also its transformation, is damaging for everybody, not just the enslaved, but also those who enslave, those who attach themselves to even the perception of power that you can gain from your proximity to slavery. So, for example, maybe the overseer who is not someone who owns either land or people, but the proximity to having some power because of slavery's reach, I think damages everybody because in some ways, and I'm going to reference Barbara Fields, the historian, of Columbia University, but also her sister Karen Fields, who is now retired. But they have a book called Racecraft, and it talks about the trickery of racism, and so it can make everything, even inanimate things, become racialized. Right? So it literally transforms, almost like a magician does, these human interactions to things that really become something other than. So when you reference this quote and this enslaved man says, I don't have a self, that's what slavery and anti-Black racism attempted to do. But what I found in the records is the ways that in resistance enslaved people were constantly protective of the identities that they did have with each other. And so even in my own scholarship, as I'm reading, medical case narratives and records, you would see the ways that, white male physicians were right about enslaved people, kind of based on the reigning ideals and ideas about Black people. But at the same time, you would see these snatches of Black people's humanity. So there's a case that I talk about, this woman named Nanny. She had given birth a lot of times. It weakened her body. She lost children. And in this last, kind of experience with childbirth, she was just weakened to the point of almost death. I mean, she does eventually die. But the doctor who writes about Nanny has just a few sentences later, he says, members from her community told me that she was fragile. And so for me, even though it's not an interview of these enslaved people, but the fact that Black people who were owned inserted themselves to tell him, right, and we don't know who they are, but to say, no, she's not just some sick woman. This woman was made to breed too much, and she's fragile. And also that he puts that in the report. So for me, I have to be able to kind of read between the lines and just not see this as a case of someone who died in childbirth, but the ways that Black people inserted their humanity, and that is an identity, right? That there is something psychological about what community means and protection and love means. Where even if I don't have the words, I can raise those points and at least ask those questions.
Oh, that's fantastic. Actually, I'll let you go ahead.
So kind of going off of that point, you talked about the various means of resistance that, these Black women, they were victimized in so many ways, and they were forced, many of them, to engage in sexual relationships with their masters, even forced to marry specific men or to engage in those relationships with other enslaved men, not of their choosing. Mm-hmm. But then how you talked about, I forget the one woman who prided herself on how she grew to love that man. And so it was kind of the quintessential instance of the slave woman who's been victimized, dehumanized, or an attempt to dehumanize her, forcing her to engage in this, what the master thinks is, strictly a physical act, to produce children and increase the capital, that he has in his slave force. But in the end, she twists that around and turns it and says, I learned to love this man. I had, 5 children by him, or however many children. And she recovered some of her humanity from one of the most inhumane positions that she was put into, which is just fascinating.
Yeah, that source was surprising for me because, you all know, in the WPA narratives, people don't speak explicitly about sexual abuse. Yeah. They sometimes use euphemisms, or they'll say, no, I don't want to talk about those things. And her slave name was Noor. She later changes it in Freedom. But it really was, for me, this special moment to use a source where you could see, for me, the dehumanization happens with the owner and those white men he invited to view these 2 young enslaved people that he selects because I guess he thinks they're going to breed well. He invites them essentially to watch these young people have sex in front of him. And then the punishment is, if the woman doesn't become impregnated, he makes them do it again, right? It really is. I'm trying not to be judgmental here, but it's something that we don't, necessarily allow in this society. So there are all kinds of ethical concerns about who invites their friends. Come on, I want you to see my 2 slaves that I selected have sex in front of a crowd. And if they don't get pregnant, then I'll invite you again to see it. And so for me, that speaks to his inhumanity, his depravity. Sure. But what happens is she and this other young man, they're both victims of sexual abuse and sexual exploitation because he didn't ask to be a part of it either. And so I think in that moment of pain and embarrassment and all of those things, these 2 victims learn to love each other. And then they learn to, or they choose, because they could have also chosen not to love their children because of how the children were conceived, but they also choose, even after slavery ends, to love their children, to create a family, to give themselves new names, so as to have a kind of talk about psychology, to have a huge psychological break from the owner. And so once again, for me, that's a teaching tool that doesn't just say, oh, these people were, the owners were sick, but to also talk about the kinds of resistance and active work of healing themselves, right, with the formerly enslaved woman and her husband, how they choose to create a new identity based on love and togetherness and kinship that's healthy as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Dierdre, could you talk to us then about how does gynecology as a field, which doesn't really take official shape into the 1880s, but how does it come out of the slave quarters? And Yeah. So if you could give us sort of, I know that's at the very heart of your book, and I'm asking you to give a tiny summary of that, but I think it would be fascinating for our
Let me tell you, I have been telling this story now for 3 years, and I swear to you, I laughed because I gave a keynote lecture very early yesterday morning, like 6:15 a.m. I think when Ashley and I kind of met up to do the run through here, I was like, Ashley, I'm so sorry for yawning. I was so tired, but it's a wonderful story to tell because I don't like things that are neat. So I like kind of the messy part and the process of trying to figure it out. I don't mind if the puzzle has a few missing pieces. And that's really what slavery and gynecology provide for me. Like everything's still a mess and a process, but that's kind of the fun part of thinking about it. So I often start with the Constitution. And my students are like, what does the Constitution have to do with slavery or gynecology? And I was like, just follow me. I'll take you on this journey. And so I say, the Constitution never explicitly says slavery, but we know that the transatlantic slave trade becomes illegal in 1807. So the Constitution bans it, right? The importation of Africans or people of African descent coming in from the Caribbean. And all of a sudden in 1808, the U.S. now has to contend with how do we keep this, successful economic labor system going. And there was a law that was created, a century before, and had been practiced 2 centuries before. And this law was based on Part 2, Sector Ventrum, that essentially says an enslaved woman passes her condition on to the child, right? And so it's a very specific racial and gendered law that only deals with enslaved women, right? So all of a sudden you have a law in place that says, all right, we don't care who the father is. The father can be white, Black, Indian, slave, free, we don't care. But as long as that mother is enslaved and she gives birth to a child, that means that we have essentially secured our wealth through the birth of this child. And so how does that happen? You have to make sure that enslaved women's reproductive capabilities are maintained, if not maintained, created. And so when you start to read slave management journals that emerged during this time, and even some of the medical journals, you would be shocked at how many people had questions around pregnancy, around birth, how to maintain women's health. The slave owners were asking about, the dimensions of lying in hospitals, or essentially hospitals for pregnant women. So this was something that was really of interest to those who were very, very, very interested in maintaining a stronghold in this labor institution. And so you started to have the rise of Southern, because they were largely Southern medical men who were really pioneering surgeons, right? No matter what we think about their politics, they were making the South a technological pioneering land, land of discovery around gynecological surgeries. And so all of a sudden you have James Marion Sims, who does a successful surgical repair for, today we call it obstetric, when women are giving birth and it's really long and protracted, and there's all this tearing that happens. He's the one who comes up with a technique that's used today in the 21st century. He perfects a speculum, meant for the examination of the vaginal cavity of cervix. You have Francois Marie Prevost, who leaves France and goes to Haiti and then Louisiana and essentially becomes known as the father of the American C-section. And he's doing this in the 1830s, where he's working on Negro slaves. You have John Peter Matau, who does the same kind of obstetrical fistula repair. Ephraim McDowell, who's the first person in the Western world who has a successful abdominal incision surgery where the patient lives. And he continues this experimental work on enslaved women. This is in 1809, right? And nobody had ever recorded a successful abdominal surgery until Ephraim McDowell of Kentucky does it. And all of these men are slave owners, right? That doesn't escape me. They're all from the South. And they all do this really pioneering work on enslaved women. And in Sims' case, he even trains his slave patients to serve as his surgical assistants and nurses. And I always joke, that's when he finally got it right. Where the two white male surgical assistants quit because he keeps failing. He trains the slaves. Slaves work, and they work really hard, and he knows they're smart. And here these illiterate women literally help him, create a successful reparative surgery, and he's pretty transparent about it. So that's how it comes about.
So I'm just, we have about 10 minutes or a little less. Here's the thing that struck me. Why did these men, as you've acknowledged, they're very smart men. They are certainly well informed on scientific knowledge and practices of the day. And in the experiments that they did, and we need to stress again that there are enslaved women who don't have a choice in the matter.
Right.
Why in God's name did they not have an epiphany and say, there's no difference here in terms of anatomy between a black woman and a white woman? Could you explain to us, how did they work through what we would see as a contradiction that's insurmountable?
Yeah. Oh my God. That's the question I always get from people. Like, how did they not know? I'm like, they did know. They knew. Because these were men who, they knew that a cervix in a black woman looked the same as a cervix in the white woman. This is why they use Negro patients to cure white people, because they knew biologically there was no difference. But, people have to cling to the belief systems of the time that guide them, right? And so I call it a case of racial cognitive dissonance, where, oftentimes these men would talk about the courageous behavior and bravery of the Negro people who didn't experience pain. And yet 2 sentences below, you're reading about how Nanny or Betsy or Lucy struggle violently, to leap from the surgical table. And I'm like, wait, if they didn't experience pain, why did you write down 2 sentences later how they resisted being restrained, right? So once again, they knew. They had sex with these women. They had children with these people. One of Sims's patients becomes pregnant during an experimental trial by a white man and has a mulatto child. So they knew. I just think that would they have gotten published had they said, especially Southern men, they would have gotten published in any legitimate Southern publication by saying, yes, there's actually no biological difference, because they were abolitionists.
Yeah, that symbiotic relationship that you find. Slavery reinforces the medical science, and in turn, medical science reinforces slavery, because they have to keep the system going, the ideology going that supports the system, which, that relationship between gender, between race, between the medical field, becoming more professionalized, that's obviously the crux of your book. But in the way that those Black women, at the same time as they're obviously subjected against their will to these procedures and these experimentations, they're passive in that regard. They're also, of course, active agents in pushing the field forward. Then they become trained, skilled laborers and helping to even take care of some of their own without the help of the white doctor down the road. Because as Black women they fear those sick houses. They don't want to go there. And so these Black women who have the training, they can disseminate that knowledge amongst the rest of the plantation, amongst the rest of, the slave cohort. And that can, in fact, undermine the very system that, white doctors were trying to create, and having always this, replenished supply of Black bodies to work on. That's another, great irony.
Yeah, it is.
I wish we had more time to talk about a really fascinating and compelling part of the book, is Dierdre's, in a sense, comparison of how Irish women were also utilized for experimentation when it came to these issues of gynecology. And it is a powerful reminder that the Black-white binary has to always be situated within place and conditions. And I came away from this book, I think, recognizing the shared plight of poor women, Irish women. And in fact, I think in some places you even almost exchange Black for Irish because of the perceptions and the attitudes toward them. This is again, as Dierdre said, it's a small book. Yeah, mighty punch, right? There's a lot of important and big ideas in this book, and it's certainly worth your consideration. And before we say goodbye this evening, I want to note that Dierdre is working on, I believe, a book on Harriet Tubman. Is that correct?
Yes, I am. I'm excited. It's going to be a book where, so I'm happy to be here because I can talk about the thing that I kind of see myself as, oh, I'm a historian of slavery, but everybody else sees me as a historian of medicine.
Right,
And in some ways it's a little confining because I'm like, yeah, I write about medicine. I can use the terms, but I'm also writing about the medical experiences of enslaved people. But Harriet Tubman, it's going to be a biography of her. I mean, obviously of her life, and she lived a mighty long life, living over 90 years old. But she also was a victim of traumatic brain injury. She might have been, we don't know, but she might have been infertile. And so there are all of these questions that one can raise, about Tubman as a disabled person, but also from the lens of medicine, which I think will open up more insight into her life. Plus, she was cool, as you know. The Civil War vet, married a man, 25 years her junior. I mean, she was just cool.
And I have not, and I don't know, Ashley, if you've had an opportunity to go out and visit it's relatively new national park.
Oh, yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, when COVID is past, we will, of the many advantages of teaching at Gettysburg, we have, of course, historic site surrounding us, but we also have DC, we have Philadelphia, and we have Eastern Maryland, which would be a wonderful trip. My dream, and it will happen, is to take students down to Southampton County and spend the night down in Richmond and to go down there as well. And it's important is, I think Dierdre's excellent overview of how the historiography has changed. For us to all recognize there's, again, a long ways to go on so many fronts. But I'm telling you, I've been doing this now for a long time, since 1985, my first Park Service job, in which Black people were almost never part of the conversation at historic sites or even in the classroom. And all that has changed so radically. And it's it's a good trajectory that we're on. I should probably say very quickly, because I think that the enslaved woman, Harriet, she deserves her story to be told, to be finished. So, and Dierdre doesn't even know. I haven't told Dierdre what happened to her.
I know what happened. I never heard of it.
Well, I won't give you all the details, except to say that one of the tragic elements of this story is that her son was forced to reveal where his mom had attacked Mrs. Cooley. It was the son that was forced to take the investigators down to that room called the pig room and to point out where there was blood all over the walls, which one could say that was maybe from a pig. Let's again note that Mrs. Cooley never identified her attacker, never did. And it was based upon that and some other evidence as well, that Harriet was convicted. She was sent down to Castle Thunder in Richmond, not far from where Ashley Luskey used to work. She used to work at Richmond National Park. Castle Thunder was just a horrific place. And there she passed.
Oh, my goodness.
During all of this, Mr. Cooley, he was gone when the attack occurred. He is not the one that instigated the investigation. And at the end of the day, because Virginia state law was written by slaveholders, Mr. Cooley was compensated for Harriet's death because she died when she was incarcerated, which is just, again, utter sick and perverse way to end this story. But as Dierdre has pointed out, the sources that we often have to tell through white eyes, but there are powerful stories that are there. And, it's a good thing that Dierdre, I'm sure she's thought about this. I hope she has. She comes from this rich intellectual tradition of African-American women that includes one of my favorites, Barbara Fields, and they're both South Carolina women, right?
In fact, Karen Fields and I went to the same junior high.
Did you really?
In DC, and her grandmother went to my mother's college, Claflin University now. So we have that like DC, South Carolina connection. Yes.
I would love to be a little fly at Thanksgiving in the Fields house.
Oh my goodness.
Let's watch them go back and forth. I wouldn't want to get in their crossfire. They're too damn smart.
Neither would I.
Too damn smart for me. I'd just like to sit back and watch all that happen. But you are certainly part of that great intellectual tradition. Thank you so much for spending your time to come and to chat with us, because you are a crazy busy person. But we are going to get you back out to CWI.
I would love that. Thank you. Thank you so much. And to your audience, thank you for your questions. I'm sorry I couldn't answer all of them, but thank you for inviting me, Ashley and Pete.
Yeah, and just remember, I'm counting on this. Godfather's Pizza. It's good.
I'm gonna let you know. I will let you know.
Get that burger with some sausage and pepperoni. You won't need to eat for the rest of the week.
Oh, I believe it.
Deirdre, thank you so much. Take good care.
Thank you so much, Deirdre. This is wonderful.
Great. Take care of yourself. Ashley, it's good seeing you as well.
Good to see you too.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.